She's not a speaker. Remove her badge. The irony was sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of polished conversation, because the woman standing at the entrance had never been given a badge in the first place. Naomi Carter didn't reach for her pocket, didn't argue, didn't even blink. She simply stood there, just outside the double doors of the private lecture hall, where soft amber lighting spilled across marble floors and the low murmur of high-level networking floated like a carefully curated soundtrack. Inside, names that shaped industries sat in tailored suits, sipping sparkling water, waiting for a conversation about innovation, equity, and the future. Outside, Naomi Carter, wearing a simple charcoal blazer, dark jeans, and flat black shoes, was being told she didn't belong. The event coordinator, a tall white man with a lanyard that seemed to grant him more confidence than authority, stepped closer, his voice lowering but not softening. This is a closed session. Invitation only. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't check again. He had already decided. Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if studying not him, but the system that had trained him to speak like that. Who approved the guest list? She asked, her tone even, almost curious. The question hung there, misplaced in a moment that demanded submission, not inquiry. He frowned, caught off guard, then recovered quickly. That's not information you need. Behind him, a few early arrivals glanced toward the door. A young woman holding a tablet paused mid-step. A man in a navy suit slowed just enough to listen without appearing to. The air shifted, barely, but enough to be felt. Naomi didn't move forward. She didn't step back. She stood as if the ground had decided she belonged there long before anyone else had a say. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," the coordinator added, now louder, performing authority for the small audience forming behind him. Another staff member approached, this one clutching a clipboard like it was evidence. "Name?" she asked, not unkindly, but not neutrally either. Naomi met her eyes. Naomi Carter. The staffer scanned the list, once, then again, slower this time, her finger dragging down columns of carefully curated names. Nothing. She shook her head. "You're not on here." A small, satisfied silence followed, as if the list had spoken the final truth. Naomi exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in recognition. She had seen this before. Not the same room. Not the same faces. But the same conclusion drawn too quickly from too little. 20 years ago, it had been a scholarship committee that smiled politely before deciding she wasn't the right fit. 10 years ago, a conference panel that somehow lost her application despite her credentials outpacing everyone else's. And now, here, at a lecture funded by millions meant to expand access, she was being denied entry at the door. A faint sound came from inside, the clink of glass, a ripple of laughter, life continuing, comfortably unaware. Naomi's gaze shifted past the staff, through the open crack of the door, into the room she already understood better than anyone inside it. Then, almost to herself, but loud enough to be heard, she said, "Interesting." The word didn't challenge. It didn't accuse. It observed. And in that observation, something unsettled began to take shape. The word update did not land like a threat, it landed like a certainty, and that difference began to unravel the quiet confidence the coordinator had been leaning on since the moment Naomi Carter stepped into his line of sight, because certainty does not need volume, it does not need repetition, it simply exists and waits for everything else to catch up. He glanced toward the staffer with the clipboard, then toward the woman holding the tablet, searching for reinforcement, for alignment, for anything that would return the situation to something familiar, but what he found instead was hesitation, small but visible, the kind that spreads faster than doubt once it takes hold. "We are not changing anything," he said finally, his tone firmer now, louder, meant to reclaim control not just over Naomi, but over the growing number of witnesses who had stopped pretending this was not happening. "If your name is not on the list, you are not entering. That is final." The word final echoed briefly, but it did not settle the way he expected, it floated, unsupported, As if the room itself was no longer convinced, Naomi watched him for a moment, not with defiance, not even with disagreement, but with a kind of quiet observation that made his certainty feel performative, like a role he was trying too hard to maintain, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same steady rhythm. Unchanged, you are enforcing a decision you did not make, based on a system you did not verify, she said, and the sentence moved through the space like a mirror, reflecting more than he intended to reveal. The woman with the tablet shifted her stance, her eyes moving between Naomi and the list, her earlier uncertainty sharpening into something more defined. Can we access the digital registry? She asked, her voice low but direct, and the staffer hesitated before answering. We only have the printed version for check-in, she said, as if that alone explained everything, but it did not anymore. Inside the lecture hall the applause rose again, louder this time, signaling the official start, the door opening slightly wider as a late arrival slipped in, and for a brief second the room beyond became fully visible, rows of seated guests, a stage lit in warm light, a speaker adjusting the microphone, a curated world already in motion. And right at its edge stood Naomi Carter, still outside, still unmoved, a man near the back of the small crowd outside pulled out his phone, not to record yet, but to hold it, ready, the instinct to document beginning to take shape, because something about this moment felt like it would matter later. Naomi's phone vibrated once in her hand, subtle, almost imperceptible, but she felt it, and her eyes lowered briefly to the screen, not to read, but to confirm. A single glance that carried more weight than any explanation she could have offered. When she looked back up, nothing in her posture had changed, but the stillness around her felt different now, heavier, as if the next move had already been decided somewhere beyond the walls they were standing in. You should check your system again, she said, not as a suggestion this time, but as a final courtesy, and the coordinator let out a short, dismissive breath, shaking his head. We are done here, he replied, stepping slightly to the side, positioning his body between Naomi and the entrance in a way that was meant to close the moment, to end it cleanly, to restore order. But order had already shifted, just not where he could see it yet, and as the second stretched once more, longer than before, the faint sound of a notification echoed from the tablet in the woman's hands, a soft chime, almost lost in the noise of the hallway, but loud enough to change everything, because this time, the system had answered back. The soft chime from the tablet did not sound urgent, but it carried a weight that shifted every set of eyes toward it at once, because in a space built on control, any unexpected signal felt like a disruption, and the woman holding the device froze for just a second before instinct took over and she looked down, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges as the screen updated in real time. The coordinator noticed the hesitation immediately, his attention snapping away from Naomi Carter and locking onto the tablet. What is it? He asked, sharper now, the first trace of tension slipping into his voice, but the woman did not answer right away, her eyes scanning the new information, her expression changing in small, almost imperceptible increments, confusion first, then focus, then something closer to concern. Naomi did not move, did not lean in, did not ask, she simply watched, as if she already knew what the screen would reveal and had no need to rush the moment, because truth, when it arrives on its own, carries more impact than when it is forced. This is not the same list, the woman said finally, her voice lower than before, no longer projecting authority but processing reality, and the coordinator stepped closer, reaching slightly as if proximity alone could restore clarity. What do you mean it is not the same list? He pressed, but she turned the screen toward him instead of answering, letting him see it for himself, and whatever he read there did not match what he expected, because his posture shifted instantly, shoulders tightening, jaw setting, the kind of reaction that happens when certainty is replaced without warning. The printed list in the staffer's hand suddenly looked smaller, less reliable, like a snapshot frozen before something important changed, and the gap between paper and system widened in a way no one could ignore anymore. Where did this update come from? He asked, his voice controlled but strained now, and the woman hesitated again before replying. It is a system override, priority level, she said, glancing briefly toward Naomi without fully turning her head, as if the connection was forming but not yet spoken out loud. A murmur moved through the small group of onlookers, subtle but growing, the kind of sound that builds when people realize they are watching something shift in real time. something that does not happen often and cannot be undone once it begins. Naomi's phone rested quietly in her hand again, screen dimmed, her role in the update invisible to everyone except the result itself, and that was exactly where her power sat, not in explanation, but in outcome. The coordinator straightened, trying to recover ground that was already slipping beneath him. System errors happen, he said quickly. Almost too quickly, as if naming it could contain it. We follow the confirmed list for entry, that does not change. But even as he spoke, the confidence behind his words had thinned, stretched too far by what he had just seen. The woman with the tablet did not look convinced, her eyes moving once more between the digital registry and the printed page, the mismatch now impossible to ignore. This is not an error, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. This is a revision, and the word landed differently than anything said before, because a revision implies intent. It implies someone with authority made a change and expected it to be followed. Naomi lifted her gaze slightly, meeting the coordinator's eyes for the first time since the update, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, but now unmistakably anchored in something deeper than patience, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet finality of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard. Your system already answered, she said, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was transitional, the kind that comes right before everything rearranges itself around a truth that can no longer be dismissed. The silence that followed Naomi Carter's words did not break immediately, it stretched, thick and deliberate, as if the entire hallway was recalibrating around a truth that had just been acknowledged but not yet accepted, and the coordinator stood there, still positioned between her and the door, but no longer anchored in the same certainty that had carried him just moments ago, because now there was a gap, not in the system, but in his authority over it. The woman with the tablet looked up again, this time directly at him, her hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet urgency. Her name is here, she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the nearby listeners heard it without effort, and the words moved through the small crowd like a ripple, subtle at first, then spreading, reshaping the atmosphere in ways that could not be reversed. The staffer with the clipboard lowered the printed list slightly, her grip loosening as if she already understood that what she was holding no longer defined the moment, and for a brief second she glanced at Naomi, not with suspicion anymore, but with something closer to recognition, though she could not yet explain why. The coordinator exhaled slowly, forcing composure back into his posture, but it came back strained, thinner, as if it had been stretched beyond its limit. That does not change procedure, he said, choosing his words carefully now, each one placed like a barrier he hoped would still hold. We still need confirmation through the official process. But even as he spoke, the definition of official had begun to shift beyond his control. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. The system you follow has already confirmed, she said, and there was no challenge in her tone, only clarity, the kind that does not argue because it does not need to. Inside the lecture hall, the speaker's voice grew stronger, filling the space with polished language about access, opportunity, and inclusion, words that echoed faintly through the doorway and settled uncomfortably against the reality unfolding just outside, creating a contrast so sharp it did not need to be pointed out to be understood. A man near the back finally lifted his phone, not hiding it now, angling it slightly to capture the scene, and others followed, not out of spectacle, but out of instinct, because something about this moment felt like it would matter beyond this hallway, beyond this hour. The woman with the tablet stepped closer to the coordinator, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the shift in tone. This is a priority override tied to the program's executive layer, she said, and the phrase carried weight, the kind that does not belong to entry-level decisions, the kind that suggests influence from somewhere higher, somewhere not present in the room but very much in control of it. The coordinator's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking once more to Naomi, studying her now with a different lens, not fully understanding, but no longer dismissing, and that change, though subtle, marked the beginning of something irreversible. Naomi remained where she was, her posture grounded, her presence steady, as if she had already stepped into the room in every way that mattered except physically, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet finality that settled deeper than anything before. You are standing between me and a system that already moved, she said, and this time, the words did not just challenge his position, they redefined it, because suddenly he was not the gatekeeper anymore. He was the delay, and the realization of that began to show, not in what he said next, but in the brief, unmistakable hesitation before he said anything at all. The hesitation that hung in the air was no longer subtle, it was visible, measurable in the way the coordinator's shoulders no longer squared fully, in the way his stance shifted just half an inch to the side as if his body had already begun to concede what his voice had not yet admitted, and Naomi Carter saw it, not with satisfaction, but with recognition, because this moment, this precise fracture between authority and reality, was one she had stood in before, many times, in different rooms. Under different names, but always built on the same assumption that power could be decided by appearance before it was verified by truth. "We are not opening that door without clearance," the coordinator said finally, forcing the words out with renewed firmness, but now it sounded less like control and more like resistance, the kind that comes just before something gives way, and the woman with the tablet stepped closer again, her voice lower but firmer now. "This is clearance," she said. Angling the screen toward him once more, "It is tied directly to the executive layer of the program," and the phrase landed differently this time, heavier, because it had already been said once, but now it was being repeated with certainty. Naomi did not interrupt, she did not reinforce, she allowed the system to speak for itself, because that was always more powerful than any explanation she could offer. And around them the small crowd had grown just enough to change the energy completely. No longer a passing glance, but a quiet audience, watching, waiting, understanding that something significant was unfolding in real time. Inside the lecture hall, the speaker paused briefly, a ripple of confusion moving through the room as someone near the front whispered to another, heads turning slightly toward the entrance, sensing the disruption even without seeing it, and that subtle shift inside mirrored the tension outside, two spaces now connected by a moment neither could ignore. The staffer with the clipboard took a small step back, her role in the interaction fading as the situation escalated beyond her level, and for the first time, she did not look at the list, she looked at Naomi, studying her with a question she had not considered before, not who she claimed to be, but who she actually was. The coordinator's jaw tightened again, his eyes flicking between the tablet and Naomi, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he believed, and failing, because belief without verification cannot withstand direct contradiction for long. "Even if this is valid," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we still need confirmation from program leadership before granting access," and there it was, the shift from certainty to dependency, from control to deferral, a subtle but critical change that did not go unnoticed. Naomi nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the progression, her voice calm, measured. "You are waiting for a response that has already been sent," she said, and the words settled with a quiet finality that made the next few seconds feel heavier than they should have been. The woman with the tablet glanced down again, her screen lighting up once more, another notification. This one longer, more detailed, her eyes widening just slightly as she read, and then she looked up, not at the coordinator this time, but directly at Naomi, the recognition finally landing fully, unmistakably, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different tone entirely, one that no longer questioned, only confirmed. "This update includes direct authorization," she said, and the hallway seemed to hold its breath, because now the system had not only answered, it had spoken with authority. And all that remained was whether the man standing in front of the door would continue to stand there, or finally step aside. The words direct authorization did not echo loudly, but they carried a finality that shifted the entire weight of the moment, and for the first time since Naomi Carter had stepped into the hallway, the silence that followed was not uncertain, it was decisive, because now there was nothing left to question, only something left to accept, and yet the coordinator did not move, not immediately. His body caught between instinct and realization, between the role he had been playing and the truth that had just rewritten it. His eyes stayed on the tablet for a second too long, as if reading it again might change what it said, but it did not, and when he finally looked back at Naomi, the confidence that had defined his earlier tone was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more careful, because now he was no longer addressing someone outside the system, he was standing in front of someone who existed above it. Naomi did not step forward, she did not close the distance, she allowed it to remain exactly as it was, because this was not about forcing entry, it was about revealing who had the authority to define it, and as the second stretched again, the world around her seemed to slow just enough for something else to surface. Something older, something deeper. For a brief moment, the hallway faded, not physically, but in her mind, replaced by a memory she had carried for years, a lecture hall not unlike this one, smaller, less polished, but built on the same quiet rules, where she had once stood at the back of the room, a student with questions, credentials, and a voice that had been politely overlooked, her hand raised, her presence acknowledged but not prioritized, and when the discussion ended, she had approached the panel, offered insight, only to be met with a smile that felt more like dismissal than engagement, a phrase she remembered clearly: "We are looking for perspectives that align with the direction of this program," and what they meant, though they never said it directly, was that she did not fit the image they had already decided to elevate. That moment had not broken her, it had clarified something, it had shown her that access was not always denied with force, sometimes it was denied with structure, with lists, with quiet decisions made long before anyone arrived at the door, and now, standing here, years later, that same structure stood in front of her again, only this time it did not recognize who had built the foundation beneath it. The memory passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind not anger, not frustration, but a stillness sharpened by experience, and when Naomi returned fully to the present, nothing in her expression had changed, but everything behind it had settled into place. The woman with the tablet lowered it slightly, her posture shifting in a way that signaled not just understanding, but alignment, and the staffer with the clipboard had already stepped back completely, her role dissolved into the background of a moment that had outgrown her authority. Inside the lecture hall, the speaker paused again, a subtle break in rhythm that hinted at awareness, at the sense that something outside the room was beginning to matter inside it, and the door remained slightly open, the line between exclusion and inclusion now thinner than it had ever been. Naomi lifted her gaze once more, meeting the coordinator's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried no edge, no demand, only a quiet clarity that settled deeper than any raised tone could. "You are not being asked to decide," she said, and the words did not challenge him, they released him from a role he could no longer hold, because the decision had already been made, not here, not in this hallway, but somewhere far above it, somewhere he had never needed to think about until now, and all that remained was whether he would continue to stand in the way of it, or finally understand that the moment had already moved past him. The word settled into the space with a quiet authority that did not demand obedience, it assumed it, and for a moment the coordinator stood there, no longer guarding the door but standing in front of something he did not fully understand, his role reduced not by confrontation, but by clarity, and that shift was harder to resist because it did not give him anything to push against. His eyes moved once more to the tablet, then to the people gathering behind him, then finally back to Naomi Carter. And this time there was no dismissal left in his expression, only calculation, the kind that comes when someone realizes the situation has already been decided and they are the last to adjust. "If this is an executive override," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then it should have been communicated through proper channels," but even as he said it, the argument felt incomplete, because the system had already spoken in a language he could not ignore. And the woman with the tablet responded before Naomi needed to, her voice steady now, aligned with what she had seen. "It was communicated," she said, "just not to this level," and the implication landed clearly. Not everything moved through him, not everything needed his awareness to be valid. A faint murmur rose again from the small crowd, no longer uncertain but engaged, the tone shifting from curiosity to recognition, because people were beginning to understand that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a misplacement of authority. Inside the lecture hall, the speaker paused again, longer this time, and a few attendees near the front began turning fully toward the entrance, their attention no longer divided, the energy of the room subtly pulling toward the disruption at the door, because even without full context, something about the moment felt significant, like a thread being pulled that might unravel more than just a delay. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that made movement unnecessary, and when she finally lifted her phone again, it was not to check anything, but to complete what had already begun, her thumb pressing once more with quiet precision, and somewhere beyond the walls of the building, beyond the visible structure of the event, another layer of response moved into place. The woman with the tablet felt it before she saw it. Another notification, this one more formal, more structured, and when she opened it, her expression shifted again, not into confusion this time, but into certainty, the kind that removes doubt entirely. She looked up immediately, her voice no longer tentative. "There is a directive attached now," she said, and every word carried weight. it is flagged as immediate, and the coordinator's posture tightened once more, not in resistance, but in realization. Because immediate did not leave room for interpretation, it did not allow delay. Naomi's eyes met his again. Calm, steady, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not need to. "You asked for confirmation," she said, "this is it," and the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to argue without denying what was directly in front of him. The hallway seemed to narrow around the moment, every detail sharpening, every second stretching, and in that space, the choice became clear, not complex, not layered, just clear. He could continue to stand where he was and be the last barrier to something already authorized, or he could step aside and acknowledge that the authority he believed he held had never been his to begin with, and as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, the entire scene seemed to wait, not for Naomi to act, but for him to decide whether he would finally recognize who had been standing in front of him all along. The word immediate did not leave room for interpretation, and for the first time since the interaction began, the coordinator did not respond right away, because there was nothing left to challenge without directly contradicting the system he had been relying on from the start, and that realization settled into his posture in a way that no instruction could override. His shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, and his stance shifted just enough to reveal what had already changed, that he was no longer the authority in the moment, only the last visible layer of a decision made far beyond him. The hallway remained still, every pair of eyes fixed on what would happen next, because now the outcome was no longer uncertain, only delayed by a single choice, and Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her expression steady, her patience not strained but precise, as if she had already accounted for this moment long before it arrived. The woman with the tablet lowered it slightly, her role no longer to interpret but to confirm, and the staffer with the clipboard had stepped fully to the side, her list now irrelevant, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness that she had witnessed something she did not fully understand yet. Inside the lecture hall, the speaker's voice paused again, this time completely, and a low murmur spread through the audience as more heads turned toward the entrance, the separation between inside and outside dissolving as attention shifted to the threshold where authority had just been redefined. The coordinator exhaled slowly, his eyes meeting Naomi's one more time, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not apology, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes when someone realizes they were never in control of the outcome to begin with. He stepped back. Just half a step, but it was enough to clear the path. Enough to shift the balance of the entire scene, and the doorway that had been guarded so carefully seconds ago now stood open without resistance. Naomi did not move immediately, she did not rush forward to claim the space, because this was never about entering quickly, it was about entering correctly, and when she finally took her first step forward, it was measured, unhurried, aligned with the quiet authority she had carried from the beginning. As she crossed the threshold, the energy inside the room changed almost instantly. Conversations faltered, attention redirected, and the speaker at the front lowered the microphone slightly, sensing the shift without fully understanding it, because presence like hers did not need introduction to be felt. Naomi walked forward with calm precision, her eyes scanning the room not for validation, but for context, and the people seated there, many of whom had arrived expecting a controlled, predictable event, now found themselves part of something far less contained, something that had already begun to expose the gap between what the program claimed to represent and how it had just operated moments before. The coordinator remained at the entrance, now behind her, his role reversed in a way he could not ignore, and the woman with the tablet stood beside him, watching Naomi step into the space with a recognition that had fully formed. Because now it was no longer a question of access, it was a question of identity. Naomi stopped just a few steps inside the room, not at the back, not yet at the front, but in a position that held the attention of both, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the space without force, without strain, but with a clarity that settled into every corner of the room. "Before you continue," she said, and the words did not interrupt, they redirected, "you may want to understand who you almost decided did not belong here." And in that moment, the entire room shifted from assumption to awareness. Because the story they thought they were part of had just been rewritten in real time. The room did not return to its previous rhythm after Naomi Carter spoke. It could not, because something had already shifted beyond correction, and the silence that followed her words was not empty, it was full of realization, spreading quietly from the front row to the back like a slow wave of awareness that no one could quite ignore or fully understand yet. The speaker at the front of the room lowered the microphone completely now, his prepared remarks suspended mid-thought, his posture caught between continuing and stopping, because whatever script he had come to deliver no longer fit the moment unfolding in front of him. A few attendees exchanged glances, subtle at first, then more direct, their expressions changing from curiosity to recognition, not of who Naomi was yet, but of what had just happened, the disconnect between the program's message and its execution settling uncomfortably into the space. Naomi stood where she was, composed, her presence steady without needing to expand, and when she took another step forward, it was not toward the stage, but toward the center of the room, positioning herself in a way that made avoidance impossible, not aggressive, not confrontational, but undeniable. This program speaks about access, she continued, her voice even, measured, carrying clearly without strain, about inclusion, about who gets to be in the room when decisions are made, and the words mirrored the themes printed on banners along the walls, themes that now felt less like values and more like claims waiting to be tested. The audience shifted slightly, a subtle movement of posture, of attention, as people leaned in not out of obligation, but because something real was finally being said, something not rehearsed, not polished, but grounded in the moment they had just witnessed. Near the entrance, the coordinator remained still, no longer part of the center of attention, but unable to step away from it either, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet awareness of the role he had played in a situation now being reframed in front of everyone. The woman with the tablet stood beside him, her gaze fixed on Naomi, not with uncertainty anymore, but with clarity, because the system had already revealed enough for her to understand that this was not a simple oversight, this was a structural failure unfolding in real time. Naomi paused briefly, not to gather herself, but to allow the room to settle into the weight of what she was saying, and when she continued, her words carried a sharper edge, not in tone, but in truth. But access is not defined by what you say on a stage, she said, it is defined by what happens at the door, and the sentence landed with a quiet force that no one in the room could deflect, because every person there had just been reminded that the door had been closed, not by policy, but by assumption. A man in the second row lowered his phone slowly, his expression thoughtful now, as if replaying the moment he had not seen but could now fully imagine, and a woman near the front crossed her arms, not defensively, but in reflection, her eyes fixed on Naomi with a focus that suggested understanding was beginning to take shape. The speaker stepped slightly to the side, creating space without being asked, an instinctive recognition that the moment no longer belonged to him. Naomi's gaze moved across the room, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, but acknowledging presence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm authority that had defined every moment before. You built a conversation about inclusion, she said, and almost excluded the person who made it possible, and this time, the words did not just challenge the room, they reframed it entirely, because the narrative had shifted from a single incident at the door to a broader truth about the system itself, and in that shift, every person in the room became part of something they had not anticipated, not just an audience, but witnesses to a reality that could no longer be ignored. The words settled into the room with a weight that did not demand a response but required one, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the truth Naomi Carter had just placed in front of them was not something that could be quickly acknowledged and dismissed, it was something that required recalibration, and that process had already begun in the silence. The speaker at the front of the room glanced toward the event organizers seated along the side, his expression no longer confident, but searching, as if waiting for direction that had suddenly become unclear, and along the walls the staff who had been moving with quiet efficiency now stood still, their roles interrupted by a moment they had not been trained to handle. Naomi remained centered, not dominating the room, but holding it, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same measured clarity, but now there was a shift beneath it, something firmer, something that moved beyond observation into action. This program does not need another panel, she said, it needs accountability, and the word landed differently than anything before, sharper not in tone but in consequence, because accountability implied change, and change implied disruption. A man near the front row leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his attention fully engaged now, while another attendee in the back lowered her phone slowly, not because the moment was over, but because it had become something more than something to capture. It had become something to understand. Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward the entrance, where the coordinator still stood, no longer a barrier, but not yet fully removed from the moment either, and without raising her voice, without turning the focus back to him directly, she continued, "Moments like this are not accidents," she said, "they are patterns," and the word pattern carried history, weight, repetition, a reminder that what had just happened was not isolated, it was part of something larger, something built into the very structure the program claimed to challenge. The woman with the tablet stepped forward slightly, her posture no longer hesitant, her role now aligned with what was unfolding, and her eyes met Naomi's for a brief second, not as staff to guest, but as someone recognizing authority where it had always been, just not previously acknowledged. Naomi lifted her phone once more, not as a gesture, not as a signal, but as a continuation, her thumb moving with the same quiet precision that had guided every step before, and somewhere beyond the room, beyond the visible structure of the event, the final layer of response was already in motion. A soft tone echoed from the tablet again, sharper this time, and the woman holding it did not hesitate as she opened the notification, her eyes scanning quickly, then widening just slightly as the full scope of the directive came into view, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the room, no longer tentative, no longer questioning. "There is an executive action attached," she said, and every word drew attention. "The program is being suspended pending full review," and the sentence landed like a quiet collapse, not loud, not chaotic, but definitive. A wave of reaction moved through the audience, not panic, but realization. The kind that settles slowly as people begin to understand that the event they had come to attend was no longer continuing as planned, that something larger had just overridden it entirely. The speaker stepped back fully now, lowering the microphone to his side, his role complete without delivering a single prepared line, and the organizers along the wall exchanged quick, tense glances, their control over the event dissolving in real time. Naomi lowered her phone, her expression unchanged, her presence still steady, and when she spoke again, her voice did not carry triumph, it carried resolution. "You do not fix systems by continuing them unchanged," she said, and the words closed the space around the moment, not as an ending, but as a shift, because what had just happened was not a disruption of the program, it was a correction of it, one that no one in the room would be able to ignore once they walked out of it. The room did not erupt after the announcement, it did something quieter, something more lasting. It absorbed the reality of what had just happened, and that absorption showed in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way conversations did not resume, in the way no one reached for applause or protest because neither response fit the moment. This was not a performance, it was a correction, and corrections do not ask for reaction. They demand reflection. Naomi Carter stood still for a second longer, not to hold the room, but to let it settle, because she understood something most people in that space were just beginning to realize, that impact is not measured by volume, it is measured by what remains after the moment passes. The speaker at the front slowly stepped away from the podium entirely, setting the microphone down as if acknowledging that the space no longer belonged to scheduled dialogue. And along the walls the organizers began checking their devices, their movements quick but controlled, trying to understand the scope of the suspension, but already knowing it was beyond anything they could reverse in real time. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room one last time, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, but acknowledging presence, because every person there had now become part of a moment that would extend far beyond that hour, beyond that building, beyond that program. Near the entrance, the coordinator finally stepped fully aside, no longer positioned as a barrier, but as someone processing the role he had played, his posture quieter now, his earlier certainty replaced by something more reflective, and the woman with the tablet stood beside him, her expression steady, her understanding complete, because she had witnessed the system not fail, but correct itself through someone it had almost excluded. Naomi began to walk toward the exit, not toward the stage, not toward the organizers, but back toward the same doorway where everything had started, her steps measured, unhurried, as if the direction itself carried meaning. And as she passed through the room, people instinctively made space, not out of instruction, but out of recognition, because presence like hers does not need to demand attention, it commands it quietly. A man near the aisle nodded slightly as she passed, not in greeting, but in respect, while another attendee lowered her eyes briefly, reflecting on what she had just witnessed. And the room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said could not be easily answered. When Naomi reached the doorway, she paused for just a moment, not turning fully back, but enough to let her voice carry once more into the room, calm, clear, final. "You did not stop me from entering," she said. "You revealed what you allow to happen before anyone even gets the chance," and the words settled deeper than anything before, because they were not about her. They were about the system, about the pattern, about the quiet decisions that shape outcomes long before they are visible. She stepped out into the hallway, the same space that had once held resistance now empty of it, the tension replaced by a stillness that felt different, not unresolved, but changed. And behind her, inside the room, no one moved to resume the event, no one returned to the script they had prepared, because something more important had already taken its place. Naomi continued walking without looking back, her phone resting quietly in her hand, no longer needed, because everything that needed to be activated had already been set in motion. And as the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, the only thing left in that room was the realization that power does not always announce itself when it enters. Sometimes it waits until it is challenged, and then it speaks once, clearly enough that no one forgets it.